Hello there, and welcome to the Future of Leadership. I'm your host, Zoë Routh. I'm a leadership futurist, facilitator, and multiple award-winning author. Here on the show, we like to ask the big questions about what's on the horizon and explore the future, and most importantly, what that means for your leadership. Let's get into it. This is the very first edition of the Future of Leadership, and we're taking all the hot hits from our previous show, the Zoë Routh Leadership Podcast, to bring you a magazine format, bite-sized, value-packed edition of leadership tips when it comes to thinking about the future and what we can do now to prepare for what's next. I'm excited to bring you the show. We have Planet Human, Planet Zoë, Read to Lead, and guest appearances where we dive deep into a particular topic on the day. And today's topic is systems for leadership of the future. How can we embrace new systems to bring leadership alive across the entire organization? So let's talk about what's on Planet Human. As I record this, two things are happening or have been happening. Assassinations, not great, and the Olympics. And I think it's important to showcase both of these at the same time because it's easy to get caught up in the terrible aspects of the assassinations and the attempted assassinations. Well, there's been one so far as I record this, attempted assassination of Donald J. Trump, which is horrible. Violence is no way to resolve our leadership differences. And yet it has a long history of trying to topple the leaders, cut off the head of the snake so that we institute a regime change or a systems change. And sometimes they have been successful. In all cases, it's devastating. This is not the way to do leadership, and certainly not what we aspire to do. The other assassinations are all in the Middle East of Hamas political leader and the Hezbollah senior commander. This is all bloodshed. Now, thankfully, we have the Olympics as a beautiful contrast to that from a leadership example, because the Olympics is all about seeing our higher selves, the better angels of our better nature. And I love the stories of courage, of companionship, of collegiality that arise through the example of the Olympics. So dial into the positivity of the Olympics and remember that we can do better as leaders. We need to encourage greater perspective so that we can look at our opponents with curiosity and compassion instead of judgment and derision. And that is a daily practice in wherever area of leadership we are focused. So let's remember that. Let's do the good stuff where we are and not get too downtrodden with all of the display of despair in the downside of what's happening around the world. There's plenty of good stuff too, and we can amplify that. So on Planet Zoë, my fourth novel, Olympus Rising, is back on my desk and I'm doing the round 2 of edits. So I'm really extending and expanding and teasing out the story. So it joins our cohort of Olympus designers as they dig into some of the ongoing challenges of how to create new communities on the moon while dealing with the old style leadership paradigms of the past that are on the earth. So they're mired in it and there's plenty of chaos going on. So that book will be in production towards the later end of this calendar year, 2024, with a release. Don't know. I haven't staked that out yet. Depends how long these particular edits take. I'm also deep into Power Games, which is my next nonfiction book. And this is really looking at how we do power in organizations and between organizations and how this affects our ability to collaborate and deliver results effectively. It's fascinating stuff. I've been learning heaps through interviews with different leaders and through the survey that I've been running. So there'll be more progress and updates and insights as we progress on the Power Games journey. Also, I've got 2 other live workshops that are coming up. I've got Power Games. The link is in the show notes and enrollment is open. There's still a couple spots left. That kicks off in September. Would love to have you join us. It's all about how to manage power without losing your soul. We think we're all good at power, but really we're not that good at it. So this is how we can avoid some of the power games and actually deliver something collaboratively and with good integrity as we go along. The other opportunity is the Leadership Conclave, and that's happening in Canberra on November 8th. It's a one-day immersive opportunity to do some big picture strategic thinking, looking at the future, in particular 2025, and some of the initiatives you might want to consider, some of the trends and movements in the zeitgeist that you might want to take into consideration to adjust your strategic opportunity. Also a good opportunity to bring your team along and do some big picture thinking, some strategic thinking alongside other people who are outside of your normal circle. So you can get a plethora, I don't even know what that word is. I just made that one up. A plethora, a whole bunch of different ideas about the future. So come and exchange ideas, do some big picture, deep thinking in the spring. That's where it is here in Australia. See you there. So our main topic is really looking at leadership systems for more extensive, expansive leadership. I love this topic because it's when we address systems that we can make systemic change. Seems logical, right? And yet we don't often do the big picture thinking around this. One of the things I think we need to start with, though, and when we ask how might we design leadership systems that raise the level of leadership across an organization, definitely what savvy organizations are thinking about. How do we get more leaders being more leaderly like? And how might we get started? I think the place to start is actually thinking about the power dynamics that are already existing in your organization. And the key premise I would encourage leaders to consider is circles before triangles. What do I mean by this? Often when we think about power, and certainly how we represent our organizations, it's usually a pyramid, a triangle form. I think this is the wrong geometry for us to build flexible, responsive, proactive, nimble organizations. We need to think about our organizations as circles, and in fact, intertwined, overlapping, engaged circles. The metaphor I'd like to think about is an organization is like a body made up of cells, tissues, muscles, all working in interconnected ways to deliver a common outcome. So it's a complex system, starting with the base unit, the cell, which in the metaphor is the individual. So how do we build the power and capability of the individual? Without that, we have no hope of delivering leadership across the organization. So our focus should be on how do I build the capability, autonomy, and delivery capacity of the individual? How do I help them feel and be more of a leader in their world? So as opposed to how do I get more out of them, which is a completely different conversation. So we start with the base unit of the circle, the individual. Then we look at the next step is looking at how do those circles, cells, interact with one another. And I call this the Gore-Tex conversation. Gore-Tex is an outdoor fabric. It's been around for, 30 or 40 years. And it's like a miracle fabric if you're in the outdoors. It allows you to be waterproof. It's like a waterproof jacket or pants. And it keeps water out from coming in, but allows you to sweat and breathe. So it's got this waterproof and permeable aspect to it. And I like to think about that when we're working together in organizations. We need to have this waterproof layer where we understand what's my responsibility and scope of accountability, what's exclusively mine, I should say. And where is the permeable layer? Where do I interface with other people? Where are those shades of gray where I interact with somebody else and our responsibilities intersect? How do I connect? How do I communicate? How do we make decisions? How do we collaborate effectively to deliver a greater outcome? So in the metaphor of how do two cells sit side by side and work well together? It's all the connectivity issues that we need to resolve. And that's often the biggest troublesome spot we have in power dynamics in organizations. And the third thing that we need to think about is more broadly, the concept of individual responsibility and accountability and collective responsibility and accountability. I think organizations do both of those things badly, and very rarely do they do both of them together at all, and therefore at all well. Meaning that often when we have KPIs, it's more about targets, and we set these high standards for the individuals to achieve or not to achieve, if we have them at all. Sometimes they're the wrong things to measure, and they drive poor behavior. So just having sales targets can lead to dishonest behavior just to hit those sales targets, particularly if you have a remuneration system attached to such targets. We need to do an overhaul of measures in an organization to ensure that the individual is still owning what they're doing every day in terms of contribution to the whole. And we need to have measures for the collective. It's always a tension to manage. So how do we keep the individual accountable while also acknowledging that an organization or a team is a system, and together we achieve collective results? It's not just about the hero individual, and it's not just about the entity in itself. So those are 3 areas to get started when it comes to thinking about good systems to grow leadership across the board. It's TikTok, tea time in the office kitchen. I'm excited to bring to you Paul McCarthy. And Paul McCarthy is an interesting fellow. He's had a number of different consultancy roles across Canada and big consultancy firms, particularly in the HR space. And he has the ignominious, I'm not sure if that's the correct word. He's had the experience of being fired 4 times from fairly senior executive roles. Now, with such an experience, you kind of wonder, what is going on here? And Paul asked that very question. He's like, what's going on here? Is it me? Is it the system? Probably a combination of both. As a result of his reflection, he has written the book, The Fired Leader. I'm just going to read the tagline, Reinventing the Future of Leadership. And I know he's desperately passionate about the future of leadership and how we need to overhaul how we recruit, how we train, how we set up our organizations to encourage divergent voices, different perspectives. And I'm all about that because I believe perspective is power. So without further ado, please welcome to the show, Paul McCarthy.
Thank you, Zoe. Nice to be here. I know we've been talking offline and having some technology glitches, but welcome. Nice to be here.
It is nice to be here. And it seems I have perennial technology problems when it comes to podcast recording. I don't know why. The internet gods are not with me today. In any case, that's all going to be part of the future. And in this particular episode, we are talking about leadership systems for the future. And I came across your profile and I was very interested in your perceptions and opinions about all of that. And there's a couple of things that I'd love to know a little bit more about you, Paul, as a leadership expert. You were fired 4 times, and then you decided that being a fired employee was what we need for the future. So can you tell us a little bit about both those things? What happened about being fired 4 times and how that transformed your perspective on what we need for leadership of the future?
Thank you, Zoe. Appreciate the platform to talk as ever. So, I was hired in a nutshell. I was hired for certain leadership qualities as a leader in 4 different organizations, 2 major consulting brands, a technology startup, as well as a boutique consulting firm. And I went through rigorous, time-consuming, lengthy, costly, in terms of finance as well as human resources costs, interview processes, on average 6 to 9 at a time. And throughout those processes, as you and your listeners will know, you demonstrate your leadership competencies. And you do that through group play, role play, panel-based interviews, etc. And I would consistently demonstrate the qualities that I have as a leader. And they would come through the evaluation process, the assessment panels, and they would be gauging my leadership qualities that way. That's a whole another conversation, but quite an outdated way of designing and getting leaders ready for the future. But here we are. So I would demonstrate those leadership qualities. I would get the job. And as soon as I started to display those leadership qualities, I would have my wrist slapped, and then I would get into trouble. And then I would ultimately be marginalized, discredited, and eventually exited or fired from the organization. And so this happened 4 times. And you could be forgiven for thinking, I am the common denominator, and it must be my issue, because I was the common denominator. And then after my 4th firing, I started to get really curious, because alongside my role as a leader, for over 25 years, I've also been the consultant that's gone out and developed clients' leadership capacity, capability, and competency. So I knew a thing or two about how to develop leaders, particularly with regard to what was coming on the horizon, so the future trends of leadership development. And I started to question, and I had an incongruence in my mind, which was we say that we want leaders with certain qualities, but then when we demonstrate them, those qualities get those leaders into trouble. But also, the future trends and the research on the horizon are saying we need a certain set of qualities as well. But why is there this disconnect? And so for me, that's what started 5 years ago, my quest to evolve the conversations that we're not having about the future of leadership and actually look to prepare our leaders in the most effective way by saying, what if we're firing and marginalizing, discrediting, and overlooking and not developing leaders who have the capacity and capability to be disruptive, because those are the qualities needed for the future to navigate. So in a sense, my hypothesis became, I wonder if we're firing the types of leaders with the leadership qualities that we will need to navigate ongoing disruption. And the year, by the way, was 2018, before what I would famously call the world's largest global human capital experiment in history, COVID. And so that's my story, essentially. That's where I came from. Many would massage their resume, update their resume, pretend it didn't happen. I went for the jugular and said, hold on a minute, there's a little bit of a hypocrisy here, and we're not talking about the hypocrisy of leadership. Why is that? And that's essentially what paved the way for the work, Zoe.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And it is a challenging thing. Why have I been fired 4 times? What's the common pattern there? And good on you for exploring it. And what I found in my research and experience is that disruptive truth tellers are never popular.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's sort of what you came to summarize as well. And yet we need disruptive truth tellers in order to challenge our assumptions and to pick away at the status quo and those sacred cows. Because if we don't, then we'll be left behind and lag behind. So what are the qualities, you came up with this acronym, the FIRED leader, that you think are essential for leadership of the future?
Yeah, and I should say just before I go into that but part of my mission is also to reframe the narrative, the conversations that we're having about leaders who have disruptive leadership capacity and capability. So normalizing disruptive capabilities as opposed to stigmatizing when we hear the word disruptive or disruption, we automatically think of a negative. So my quest is to reframe that. So instead of normalizing dysfunction, we normalize disruption, and that's a central theme running through my work. So the 5 qualities, and I should caveat before I briefly go through them. I spent about a year doing some research behind the scenes globally to determine whether the leadership qualities of the future are featured in the way that we develop leadership today, i.e., are those qualities in the leadership development programs? In fact, do they feature in the way we identify, recruit, and onboard and develop leaders? And they don't. And so these 5 qualities are either missing or severely downgraded, downplayed, underestimated, and really not that prominent in the way leaders are identified, recruited, onboarded, or developed. F stands for fresh thinking. So that's the ability to bring a different capacity to think, the courage to think and act differently. I is the inquisitive nature. So building on the work of Professor Francesca Gino from Harvard and Rebel Talent, she talks about curiosity being the new business case for the future. Inquisitive nature is of a similar nature, but goes a lot deeper. The person that always asks why in the room and zigs when everybody's zagging. R is for real and accountable. So being real, showing up. And I don't just mean a bumper sticker approach to being real or authentic. I mean being real, right, down to your core and showing up as your whole self to work. Many might call it servant-based leadership, compassionate leadership. But there's a second dimension to being real, which is being accountable for being real. So your self-accountability as well as accountability by the organization and your peers and your team. E is the expressive and challenging. So E is the person who challenges the status quo. And again, I don't mean just at a surface level because it's quite trendy and sexy to challenge the status quo or put it on a resume. I mean, really challenge the status quo. Why do we do this? Why do we do it this way? It's always worked this way and it always has worked. But that doesn't mean it's fit for the future kind of attitude. And D is my favorite one because I think D is one reason why I got fired more than any other reason, which is direct and transparent. And that is quite simply, you do not play the political game, because the future of leadership and the future of work will not be predicated on the ability to navigate or maneuver a political chessboard. So instead of playing an outdated game of politics, some might call it influence by another name, but it's still quite manipulative and underhand. Direct and transparent is being, talking, cutting through the crap, talking about the elephant in the room. So in a nutshell, those are the five qualities. And I put together a simplistic approach to the future leadership qualities needed, but that's almost a post-it note guide, which underlying it has a methodology, a framework, a whole set of approaches and techniques to help leaders and organizations integrate those qualities into organizations.
And they all sound fantastic. I mean, who doesn't want fresh thinking, inquiry, being real and accountable, expressive and challenging, direct and transparent? Though when the direct and transparent, as I was reading your book, I'm like, I wonder if part of the reason why fired leaders, as you describe them, are fired is because they lack tact. And you kind of insinuated that by saying you don't play political games. I call those power games in workplaces. And I'm at the moment very interested in exploring, can we eliminate power games or political games? Mm-hmm. Is it possible to restructure organizations so those are minimized or eradicated? And I'm curious about your perspective on that.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. And I think far from not having tact, fired leaders are compassionate, empathetic, genuine, and can read the room, so have high levels of EQ. And by the way, this isn't just my take on this for being a disgruntled leader who was fired. I spent 5 years pounding the pavements, as it were, to talk with other people who have these qualities. That will inform and shape book number 2. But there is a growing army of leaders who have these qualities in organizations right now that are not being seen and valued for who they are. And they're perhaps the most tactful leaders that your organization will have. But in terms of the power games and political games, I think and again, all my research and conversations and case studies and anecdotal interviews and formal interviews with chief people officers, VPs of HR, people in the world that we serve, they all imply the same thing, but it's lacking. And that is how to create the space for honest-based conversations in organizations. That really is at the crutch of this. Amy Edmondson, in her work around psychological safety, talks about the need to create fertile soil. For me, it goes a little bit deeper than that. It talks about, well, why aren't we talking about things from an honest lens? Why are we not creating conditions for trust-based dialogue and having these uncomfortable conversations, getting the elephant out in the middle of the room? Because once we do that, Zoe, we can then start to reinvent the organization. We can start to almost do a current state audit of the different parts of the organization that aren't working. And we can have those honest conversations about outdated narratives and approaches. But it starts from having the conversation, which is, we're playing politics, aren't we? Why are we doing that? How is that valuable? Why is it benefiting us? What would happen if we didn't work like that? And no organization to date that I've talked with or been contacted by does that. And yet we spout that across the boardroom walls about integrity, trust, character, but our organizations are not characterized by that. Why is that?
They have a lot else. They have a lot of other things on their agenda. is the first pushback around that. And I suspect there's two things that I suspect, Paul, and I'm wondering about what you think about that. Some of it is down to our leadership maturity and the need for status as part of our leadership growth. And with status comes jockeying for position and making sure we get appropriate recognition. Those are kind of early power games, if you like, that show up as we enter the workforce and we rally to try and get some recognition. So that comes part and parcel of our personal leadership maturity. And it's only after we have accolades and recognition and status that becomes slightly less important, but still part of our DNA. So that's my first hypothesis about why the games exist. The second one is more around the leadership systems that you alluded to. It goes back to how do we organize ourselves at work? What are our common expectations and understandings about how we work, as in how do we expect to have conversations that are open and honest? How do we create the safety around that? What are our onboarding protocols, our training protocols, our group development protocols that ensure that base level of psychological safety is in place so that we can throw what I call poo bombs on the table and no one's afraid of getting splattered. We can speak the truth, we can name the elephant, and we can shovel that elephant poo around and nobody feels threatened by it all, which is why they fire truth tellers, is because it's usually a threat of some sort. So that's my 2 cents worth. It comes down to leadership maturity and or lack of systems in place. What's your point of view about why people play these games, Paul?
One word: fear. It comes down
Okay.
to fear, because you talk about, and by the way, spoiler alert for anyone that wants to know if these systems are accurate and designed for the future in an effective way. They're not. And so we know from the data already. I mean, I've gone on record for years now spouting stuff from Gallup, Brandon Hall Group, DDI, loads of different research sources. All I've done, Zoe, over the years is connect the dots and start to say, why is it we have $8.9 trillion a year in disengagement? Why is it that 1 in 4 of your leaders is looking to leave right now? Why is it that none of your leaders are given individually tailored and prescribed learning? Why is it a cut and paste methodology to learning and leadership development? Again, whole other conversation that we may not have time for. But I will say that the top note of that, the Coles notes of that research, is that the future generation of talent do not want the way that they've had it up until now. This is why people are not joining organizations. This is why people are not staying at organizations. And when I start to uncover the cost of, you talk about accolades and the search for status and the leadership maturity in the current or outdated systems, future leaders don't want that. And we also know that the reverse, the counterintuitive effects of what you've just mentioned result in things like productivity dips, morale issues, turnover. So the estimated cost for leaders who leave your organization, who don't play those games, who don't get that promotion, who don't get that coveted job title, who don't play the leadership maturity game, it's 213 to 400% of a leader's base salary every time that leader exits an organization. Now, that's just from research on voluntary turnover. No one to date, and I mean no one to date, has done any research on the true cost of involuntary turnover globally. So for me, I love the way that you put poo bombs. You throw, the concept of poo bombs. I think we COVID was an accelerated lever, however tragic that was, for us to have the first rumblings of the conversations that we need about talking fully about what I call ego-based leadership, and the fact that those disruptive truth tellers step on ego-based landmines, ego-based leadership landmines. I've done it myself. I know thousands of people who've contacted me behind the scenes who have also done it, thanked me for my courage and bravery, at which point I say, hold on, I'm no messiah. All I am is someone that's trying to create the conditions for constructive, open, forward-moving dialogue to prepare our systems for the future. So for me, and even Frederick Laloux talks about it in Reinventing Organizations, which is his seminal work on how to design the organization of the future. He talks about this, and I was talking about this 5 years ago, and I was being laughed out of CEOs' offices when I said, in the future, all of you as a leadership team, you'll be setting each other's remuneration packages. You won't be leading with any roles or titles, and you'll be mission focused and purpose based. And they laughed me out of their offices because that wasn't what they considered pivotal to the bottom line. But it is the bottom line, because if you do not take care of your people, they will leave, which will have a financial consequence, an impact on morale, productivity, an impact on the ability to deliver your clients' agendas. And guess what? You'll no longer be an employer of choice. So it will directly hit the bottom of that spreadsheet that many people are concerned about with the P&L of their organization. So for me, it all comes back to having the honest conversations. And I'll just close this segment off by saying, in my experience, great leaders facilitate the conditions for others to be better leaders than them. And that means without title, without ego. And it doesn't matter what level of maturity you are and what games you play, you have to facilitate the conditions for others to be better than you. And that's what a great leader does.
That's true. And yet we operate in systems which are still hierarchical and performance based.
Yeah.
And I wanted to speak a little bit to Lalou and Holacracy, as you alluded to, because I got very excited when I first read Lalou's work a couple of years ago and did a big deep dive over the last 18 months into Holacracy and horizontal leadership. And it's aspirational and certainly inspirational. And yet, I don't think it's the be-all and end-all solution to everything. Largely for what I mentioned previously is that we have these hardwired inner workings of leadership maturity that we have to resolve and work through. And we can't leapfrog past that. We can't leapfrog past the need for status. It is still part of us. How quickly we do that is up for discussion and probably a useful conversation for leaders to help us. How do we create conditions so that people can accelerate their leadership maturity is a question that I'm very interested in doing. And sometimes the structures can help accelerate that. And certainly that was a hypothesis I took to one of my books, Terra Blanca Insurrection, where the idea was, let's create a community and systems that can help accelerate human leadership maturity. We can bypass all these earlier power game issues and dramas and see if we can get there. And yet circumstances can conspire to set us backwards, unfortunately. We need the tension. We need to have the aspirational focus and ability to be this sort of partner of equals, knights of the round table, no one above each other, shared collaboration and purpose, where we are setting each other's KPIs and remuneration. Fantastic. I can see a lot of people being horrified at the concept, at the idea of that. And yet it's for the collective good. So there's got to be the tension to manage between this open, honest, collective focus and enterprise, as well as the individual reward system. And I don't think there's any system that's perfect around that. And yet what you talk about is scale it right back. Where do we start? And that's having the conversation. Why are we doing it this way? How might we do it differently? How might we create the environment where we could have robust conversations, where we could throw this idea of setting each other's KPIs and remuneration? How about that? What would that be like? And what buttons is that pushing? And be curious and lean into that. So what do we need to overcome in order to create this utopian vision of these fired up leaders where it's a collective focus and it's a healthy, thriving organization? You mentioned fear before, Paul. Is there anything else that we need to overcome?
Yeah, well, there's an adjoining word to fear, and it's called awakening. And so before I go into what I mean by that, I will say that the people I'm speaking with are not seeing this as a utopia. The people I'm seeing desperately want this, and they don't know where to start because they don't know how to unravel the mosaic of, you call it poo bombs, but the mosaic of stuff that we've created. It's like scar tissue. There's been the current organization today is so characterized by unhealthy scar tissue that we can't get rid of it. Like I use this analogy quite a lot. I broke my pinky finger a few years ago, and I didn't keep up the exercises and that the physiotherapist advised, and now I have limited mobility with my pinky finger. The same is true of the modern day organization. At first, we normalized the fact that, hey, Zoe and Paul were in a meeting with Joe, and then they finished the meeting, but Paul's not invited to the after meeting. Why is that? Oh, Zoe and Joe just have something to talk about. Well, no, they don't. That's the creation of silos. All of a sudden, that becomes the norm. And we've normalized deviance. In my case, I call it normalized dysfunction. That becomes part of the way the organization works, to the extent that every person that joins you now thinks a meeting before the meeting, a meeting after the meeting are normal practices. No, they're not. They're cultural inventions that help hide and foster ego-based approaches to leadership. So the first thing, in addition to understanding fear, that needs to happen is what I call awakening. I work with clients on a almost like a 5 scale approach. So you've seen the Matrix, and you've seen the blue pill versus red pill. Right? That's exactly the model that I'm seeing unfold in the world. There are those that were going to stick their head in the sand and never be interested in this stuff. But to those people, I say something very clear. The train has left the station. You need to decide if you're going to get on, when you're going to get on, because if you're not, you'll be a dinosaur. The old, outdated systems will not flourish in the future. That, and that's just not me saying that, Zoe. That's the research. That's everyone I'm speaking to. And interestingly, a lot of them are talking about this behind closed doors because there's still a fear of the system itself. But then I say the awakening piece is realizing the impact that all of this dysfunction is having on your approach to leadership, having on your organizational dynamics. Then we get to a point where I call it courage. So that's where you've seen all the data points, you're aware of the impact that this stuff is having on your organization, on your approach to leadership, and on the effect of your work and the effectiveness of your work. So then you decide to do something about it. You've got the courage. So you've leaned into that. Now all of a sudden you're evolving your approach because you're living from a place of, I want to create a purpose, mission-based environment for the future. I'm not going to let ego or surface level stuff hold me back, to the point that you now embody this new way of being. And so that, for me, we're seeing examples all over the world in different sectors, different sizes of organizations. People are starting to wake up. 5 years ago, Zoe, I don't know about you and your research and what you found, but 5 years ago, how prevalent were the terms toxic workplace or toxicity in the work? They weren't. We weren't talking about this stuff as openly as we are now. So imagine what 5 years from now will look like. And that's what excites me.
Well, it'd be
But
great
it
if we could
comes,
unplug from toxicity and have something completely different. That would be amazing. I
yeah,
like
I
your
mean,
process. From fear to
well, thank you.
awakening to courage is great. Paul, are you ready for the fast three?
I think so. Fast three. Hit me.
I'm hitting you. Here we go. What is the future technology you most want right now?
I'm assuming that this is something that's not in place, but that I would like to have in place.
Yeah.
I would like a way to, and I've been thinking about this and writing about this recently, and this may make you smile because we're seeing it all the time. In fact, I've got an article coming out called Fraudulent Gurus. I would love a piece of software to help determine and curate can I swear on this podcast? Because you
Go
said
for
poo
it.
bomb. Um,
It's
I'd
hardly
like
a
a way
swearing.
to, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'd like a way to curate and siphon out all the bullshit that's generated by AI and the fraudulent gurus that's fact checked and truth checked in the moment, that tells me and delivers something right to my inbox, whether this was true or this was fabricated or this was generated by an artificial intelligence. That's what I'd really like, because underpinning that, Zoe, is my firm belief, and I have some, we could take up a whole hour with this, but all of these environments have stopped us thinking for ourselves. We have lost the ability for critical thinking that we so desperately need to embody the future of leadership. So that's the first technology that I would love to have.
Okay. I'm not sure that we have lost the ability for critical thinking. I think it's in danger. I'll agree with you there. All right. Number two, best tip you ever got for leadership.
Can I cheat and say two? I
You're
have
going to
two.
do it anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah, you got to fire me. So avoid knee-jerk reactions. That's the first one. And the second one is get comfortable with ambiguity.
Yeah. I think that getting comfortable with ambiguity and its cousin uncertainty is critical. I think that's kind of a muscle that needs developing. I concur. All right. Number
Yeah.
three, what are you reading or listening to right now?
Can I cheat again? Um, I'm reading well, it's audio. It's and I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. And there's a book that I'm listening to called Falling Upward by Richard Rohr, and it explores the two halves of life. You know, the first half, which is about our identity formation, and the second half, which I'm in my second half. I'm over 50, which is about spiritual awakening. And and it's not until you get to the second half of your life that you really understand the first half of your life. And so this path that I'm on didn't happen until my second part of life. So now, I mean, so I've started to read this book. So that's the first one. And then the second one, I love anything by Michael Singer. So Michael Singer wrote The Untethered Soul.
Mhm.
And I'm reading a book called Living Untethered, which is about how to take his utopic ideas and put them into everyday practice. So as well as leadership books that I could spout off that I'm reading as well, I just mentioned those two because I think this path and this kind of work, if you're not aligned with your own identity and your own spiritual path, this stuff can be quite lonely and it can be quite difficult. So those kinds of things really keep me on this path, and I like to read those kinds of materials because I think that gives a holistic approach to the work that I'm doing, and for me as a person.
Thank you. I would, yeah, I have found that too. Doing this sort of advanced leadership thinking is a lonely path because there's not that many people doing it. And so we are very much stuck in conventional ways of being and doing. And so constantly pushing on the leading edge can be quite tiring, for sure. Well, thank you, Paul. That was the Fast Three.
Thank you.
So, Paul, is there a question I haven't asked that you'd love to answer before we sign off?
Yeah, I think there's one that uh, I've got so known for doing this work. But everybody forgets that I've been doing this for 5 years. 4 of those 5 years intentionally, not trying to go out and commercialize, productize, whatever you want to call it, but just sow the seeds and see if we're having like just dropping different truth bombs into the world and seeing how they resonate. But very few people. So when people get to know me like you get to know me now, you've already seen me. I'm an established best-selling author. I've got a globally recognized 1% leadership podcast, speaking, consulting. Everybody sees these tangibles, but nobody really asks me why am I doing this work.
Why
So
are you doing this
that's
work?
that's the question. That's the question that I I don't often get asked at this point because I've got all those other things in place. So surely it's obvious why I'm doing this work. But the reason, and I've never forgotten this visual because it's always in my mind when I'm asked this question or when I have to repurpose or remind myself why I'm on this path. It's for the future leader who isn't even born yet. So the future leader that never has to inherit this kind of dysfunctional, toxic based system that we've all accepted either complicitly or we're complacent to, that we've just inherited because the future leader doesn't want this. And I will never meet that future leader who's standing around the water cooler saying, hey, to their peers, you should check out that fired leadership program. At first I was a bit skeptical, but boy, has it changed the way I do leadership. And that's why I'm doing this work, because I want to evolve the conversations on an individual level to basically leave something behind on this planet that is a bit better than what I found it in. So that's why I'm doing it.
Okay. Well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. I love that
Thank
vision,
you.
and I love the vision of affecting generations following us, not just lining our own pockets, which is the pessimistic view of why we do this kind of work. And so, where can people find
Yes.
out more about you and the work that you're doing for future generations in leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite findable on LinkedIn. If you search Paul McCarthy, you'll find me quite easily. Fired Leadership. PaulMacLeadership.com is my website as well. And obviously, anywhere where you get books, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, Booktopia, you'll find my book, The Fired Leader: Reinventing the Future of Leadership.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul. That was fabulous. I love to meet fellow travelers who are interested in shaking things up and reshaping. the systems and workplaces that we can put in place to make leadership better, which is ultimately about creating a better future. So thank you so much for your contributions and for coming on the show.
Zoe, thank you. It's an honor. Really appreciate meeting people like you. Thank you so much.
Read to lead. Today's recommendation is from Ginny Whitelaw, who was on the Zoë Routh Leadership Podcast a couple of years ago. And I loved this book of hers, Resonate, Zen, and the Way of Making a Difference. What I love about it is that it's an embodied leadership practice, meaning she considers the human body as an instrument of leadership because our energy has a ripple effect. It goes out into the world and it interacts with other humans. And in that way, we can have a great energy that creates a synergy, a resonance, and it helps influence the agenda, your project, your vision. What I also love about this book is that she has 4 types of leadership energies that we can move into. We've got the driver, the organizer, the collaborator, and the visionary. And we need all of those energies at different times in order to resonate and amplify the attitude and energy and activity of those around us. So she has some excellent practices. All the usual suspects are there: meditation and mindfulness, as well as some physical practices to get our energy tuned to the project or intention that we want for our leadership agenda. Highly recommended. Ginny Whitelaw, Resonate, Zen, and the Way of Making a Difference. Well, that was our first edition of The Future of Leadership. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please rate and review the podcast. It really does make a difference in getting the ideas out into the world. If you like some of the concept, share it with others, teach others what you have learned. If you become an insider by signing up at zoerouth.com, going to podcast, you get a whole bunch of book reviews and recommendations as a bonus. Thank you. You also get, with each and every episode, a implementation cheat sheet, some discussion questions so you can lead an excellent discussion with your peers and colleagues around the concept so you can further embed and implement. And the third thing is water cooler factoids, something interesting about the episode and the topic that you can sit around the water cooler looking very smarty pants. And it's all about being smarty pants. So that's by going to zoerouth.com and clicking on podcast. And you can sign up and join the insiders to get all the bonus extras. In the meantime, I would love if you would live with grace, lead in service, live well, lead well.